everyone. I'm with Volunteer. Every time that starts, I always stop, but I'm with Voluntary Advantage and obviously Hub International, and I could not be any more excited today to personally introduce a friend and colleague, someone that Heather and myself had the fortunate opportunity to meet a number of years ago. And through his work and practice, we thought it was absolutely critical to bring Dr. Gerard Guillory to the table today to talk about the things that he's been working on for the past 20 plus years in his practice and being able to change lives fundamentally through functional medicine. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gerard Guillory.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here to present about something I'm very passionate about, which is functional medicine. Just to give you a little background, I wrote the first book in 1989 for patients with irritable bowel syndrome, and then here are 3 editions of a second book. So I've been studying gut health for a long time, and you hear more and more about leaky gut and the gut-brain axis and how important it is to maximize gut health as the starting point for launching you on a path to optimal wellness. And so that's really what we want to talk about. I also have a background in physician management. In the 90s, I was the chairman of the board of the largest physician group in Colorado, and that's when Medicare Advantage plans were just getting started. And I was the one responsible with going out there and talking to these docs about how we could do well with the Medicare Advantage plan and how we could do that by controlling healthcare costs. And back then, before we had RAF adjustments and so forth, it was just based on age and sex, and it was all about keeping people out of the hospital. But what I want to talk about today is how your employees, you yourself, can really take charge of your health by understanding a few simple principles. So what I want to talk about next is what is functional medicine? And the way I like to explain functional medicine is I like to contrast it to traditional medicine. And the traditional medical model is the disease drug model. Here's the disease, here's the drug. Big pharma runs the show, particularly as relates to education. There's a lot of testing done, a lot of times that's unnecessary. And I'm not saying all that doesn't need to be done at some point, but I think with a little guidance, a lot of individuals could learn to kind of figure things out on their own. So I'm going to start out with a brief story. This just happened a few weeks ago. So I go to get my hair cut, and I ask the woman who cuts my hair, "What have you been up to?" And she said, "Well, my husband was just seeing a lung specialist because he's had a cough and wheezing for a year. They did all sorts of tests, put him on some expensive medications, which they couldn't afford. They have no insurance. And my first question was, is he on blood pressure medicine?" And she said, "He is." And I said, "Well, make sure he's not on a class of medications called ACE inhibitors, which are well known to cause a cough." And sure enough, his cough started a year ago when he was put on this medication, lisinopril, to treat his high blood pressure. So at my suggestion, he goes off the med, cough goes away. That's simple. And so functional medicine has 4 tenets. One is to remove. You want to remove anything that is making you sick. The second is to replace anything that you're deficient in. The third thing is to repair any damage that's been done, usually to the lining of the intestine. And then the last thing is to re-inoculate the gut with appropriate probiotics. So you'll often see a tree like this as sort of a logo for functional medicine. And at the bottom and the roots, these are some of the things that can cause the problems. And at the top of the tree, these are some of the manifestations. I'm going to talk briefly about one of the roots, and that's MSG and aspartame, which is an area of interest of mine. We did a study in the 90s. It was an original investigation where we fed patients with irritable bowel syndrome a meal with and without MSG to see if it caused symptoms, and the study was positive. So we're going to talk just very briefly about that. And then the main thing I want to talk about, if you look at the bottom where it says leaky gut, I want to talk about leaky gut and how it can manifest in autoimmune inflammatory disorders. So a brief word about MSG and aspartame. So here's another real patient example, 55-year-old attorney. has migraine headaches chronically, seeing the neurologist, getting Botox injections, all these costs associated with that. And so I talked to him about MSG and aspartame and how those can trigger migraine headaches in susceptible people. And his eyes got real big and he said, I go to Costco once a week and buy sugar-free gum with aspartame by the case. And so we got him off the sugar-free gum, and you know the rest of the story. No more headaches, no more Botox, no more neurology visits, and so forth. So MSG is the sodium salt of glutamic acid. Aspartame has aspartic acid. Both of these amino acids can stimulate what's called the NMDA receptor in the brain. And in susceptible people, that can trigger migraine headaches. I know if I have MSG, I get a little headache, but brain fog. I feel like I had Thanksgiving dinner. And a lot of people are reacting to these substances and they don't know it. And so another example of something simple through just education, I've given talks to thousands of people, and I can't tell you all the response I've gotten from people who said, I never knew that the aspartame was causing these symptoms. And so just another example of how functional medicine works. So I want to talk about the autoimmune epidemic that we're having right now. And it's important to note that 1 in every 5 Americans has an autoimmune disease. 50 million Americans have 1 or more autoimmune disease. So if you have 1 autoimmune disease, you're 3 times more likely to get a second one. And there are more than 100 autoimmune diseases. Now, how are these patients treated now with their rheumatoid and lupus and so forth? They're treated with these very expensive biological agents that can cost in the neighborhood of $5,000 a month. And what I'm here to tell you is that if you can seal and heal the gut, you can stop the autoimmune process. I'm talking stop it in its tracks. I actually practiced for 38 years. I wasn't always a functional medicine practitioner. That's something I kind of evolved into. But in my last 20 plus years of practice, it's rare I ever sent one of my patients to a rheumatologist. And our practice was unique in that we did functional and traditional medicine. Being an MD, I could prescribe if need be. Our focus was on natural treatments. We also accepted most insurances, where a lot of functional medicine practices were cash only. And then the third thing is we could be your primary care home. So I had nurse practitioners and nutritionists. I tried to see all the new patients, try and get them on the right trajectory, figure them out, and then turn them over to the nurse practitioners for their ongoing primary care. And the nurse practitioners were also trained in functional medicine. So autoimmune disorders is a huge problem. And so this is a study that just came out in October, and it showed that if you have a leaky gut, you're 30 times more likely to have an autoimmune disorder. So it's really starting in the gut. And leaky gut seems like kind of a quacky diagnosis, but if you call it increased intestinal permeability, which sounds much more scientific, and you go Google increased intestinal permeability on PubMed, you'll find literally thousands of studies. So you'll hear more about it. So in this study, how did they determine patients had a leaky gut? So there's a protein molecule called zonulin, and zonulin regulates the permeability of the small intestine. And it acts sort of like a garage door opener to open your garage, let your macronutrients in. Then there's another protein called occludin, which closes the garage door. And in patients with leaky gut, they have an overexpression of zonulin. So if you measure the zonulin antibodies and they're elevated, then that tells you that person likely has leaky gut. So this is mainly used in research settings and cutting edge functional medicine labs, but you can measure zonulin antibody level. So if you have leaky gut as determined by an elevated zonulin antibody, you're 30 times more likely to have an autoimmune disorder. And I want to talk just a minute about what is leaky gut and try and help you understand what's going on here. So I liken the lining of the small intestine, which is 1 cell layer thick, I liken it to cheesecloth. So if you were to pull some food in the blender, pour it in the cheesecloth, you're going to get the liquid on one side and the solid material should stay on the other side. So with leaky gut, you basically have damage to your cheesecloth. So when you pour that mixture in there, you're going to get chunks of partially digested food and bacteria and all sorts of sewage from your small intestine into the bloodstream. Now, all of the blood supply from the 20-something feet of small intestine goes next to the liver through what's called the portal venous circulation. So it goes from the small intestine to the liver for further modification of your nutrients. And the liver is your main detoxifying organ. So another epidemic we're seeing is in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when I present a case at the end. So what's the economic impact for those of you that are in HR and you work for companies that are self-insured? This ought to really get your ears wide open, because we spend about $100 billion per year treating autoimmune disorders versus $50 billion a year for treating cancer. But then when you look at how much is spent on research, we spend a little over $500 million on autoimmune research and $6.1 billion on cancer, when the autoimmune disorders are causing chronic inflammation, autoimmune, and that leads to cancer, quite frankly. To the extent you have an autoimmune inflammatory condition, you're more likely to get cancer. So I'd like to use two examples of autoimmune disorders. One has been an area of interest of mine, and that's celiac disease. And celiac disease, this is going to get a little complicated, so bear with me for a minute, but I think it's worth your attention. Celiac disease is the worst reaction you can have to gluten, and it's an autoimmune disorder. So what does it mean when you have an autoimmune disorder? That means that your body is making antibodies that are attacking your native tissue. And celiac now affects about 1% of the population, up from about 1 in 3,000 in the 70s. And they were able to get stored blood from the 70s. And along the way, the genes for celiac were discovered, and there were antibody tests that could diagnose celiac disease, where before you had to do an endoscopy with a biopsy and look for damage to the villi to diagnose celiac disease. Now you can diagnose it with antibody tests, and you can tell who's likely to have it because of the celiac gene association. So they were able to go back to blood in the 70s and go, well, there were 25% of the population had the celiac gene in the 70s, and it's 25% today. So there hasn't been this huge genetic shift, which would be very unlikely to cause an increase in the celiac gene basically being turned on. So your genes can be turned on or turned off, and the study of that is called epigenetics. So to get celiac disease, you have to have three things. You have to have the gene. You have to be exposed to gluten. So if you had the gene and you never were exposed to the environmental trigger, which would be gliadin or gluten, you're not going to get it. And the third thing is you have to have increased intestinal permeability from something else, which is to say your cheesecloth gets damaged from something else. You get portions of the partially digested gluten protein into the bloodstream, and that triggers the gene to get turned on. And we're going to talk in a minute about one theory as to why that's happening and why we're in this autoimmune epidemic. So that's kind of leaky gut. Think of a damaged cheesecloth. This sewage from the small intestine shouldn't be in your bloodstream. And then when it gets in there, it tends to percolate in the bloodstream and often lands in distant sites like the synovial capsule, which surrounds your joints. And then you end up with joint aches and pains. That's really coming from this autoimmune reaction that's being triggered from a damaged cheesecloth. So this is an interesting slide from the Journal of Toxicology, and the yellow bar represents the increase in celiac disease over the years. And the black line represents the introduction of glyphosate or Roundup into the food supply. And just because these track perfectly, and there are several other charts that look similar with other disorders like Hashimoto's, just because they track together is not cause and effect. You can't say that's what's causing it, but what you can say is that glyphosate damages the lining of your small intestine, and it also can disrupt your microbiome. And your microbiome is this balance between the good bacteria and the bad bacteria that allows you to digest your food appropriately. And one way to think about that is to think about how yogurt's made. So if you take milk and you add Lactobacillus acidophilus and you put it out at 90 something degrees for a few days, you're going to have yogurt. If you take that same milk and put it out at 90 something degrees, which is our body temperature, for the same amount of time, you're going to end up with sour milk. So what I learned over the years in treating patients with irritable bowel syndrome, if you reestablished a normal microbiome, they were making yogurt instead of sour milk. So a lot of this is at play, but glyphosate may be one of the things that has triggered this autoimmune epidemic. So really what you want to do is you want to try and eat organic as much as possible to avoid some of these chemicals like glyphosate. So now I want to talk about Hashimoto's, which is also called autoimmune thyroiditis. If you have 300 people in your audience right now, the odds are 30 of them have Hashimoto's. The incidence keeps going up. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, so I've been on the center stage of what's happened with a lot of these developments in medicine over the past almost 4 decades. And it used to be, I would see a Hashimoto's patient a month, and now it's 3 or 4 a day. And Hashimoto's is probably, so it's an autoimmune disorder. Remember that you make antibodies against a portion, usually of a protein in a food, in this case, gluten. And the antibody that's being directed against that segment of the gluten protein cross-reacts with the native thyroid tissue because the sequence of amino acids is the same. And under normal circumstances, you shouldn't have chunks of protein getting in your bloodstream. You should have the constituent amino acids that make up proteins coming across if it's been digested appropriately and your cheesecloth is intact. So Hashimoto's common. Remember what I said earlier too, if you have one autoimmune disorder, you're 3 times more likely to get a second one. And patients with Hashimoto's, so you diagnose Hashimoto's by looking at anti-thyroid antibodies in the blood, so it's easy to diagnose. And if you catch those antibodies as being elevated early on, I call it the burn up phase, those patients still have a thyroid that's functioning, so their thyroid hormone levels are normal, even though their thyroid gland's under attack. But after a while, the thyroid gets burnt out and then thyroid's gone, and then you're committed to taking thyroid hormone replacement for the rest of your life. So we screen for patients to try and catch Hashimoto's patients in that early phase, fix their gut, get them off gluten, they don't develop full-blown Hashimoto's. So the main thing I want to point out here, you can read on the left about the permeability of the epithelial lining can cause junk to get into your bloodstream that shouldn't be there. But the thing on the right that's important is that leaky gut's also been associated with a range of mood disorders. And if you look at celiac disease, there are more neurological manifestations of celiac disease than there are digestive, even though people think of it as a digestive disorder. 40% of people with celiac have no digestive problems. And what I'd like to do, since my interest has been in irritable bowel syndrome, is just take a minute to try and explain what happens and how food intolerances can be a little complicated, because there's a variety of mechanisms that can underlie reactions to food. So for example, you can have an enzyme deficiency. The prototype would be lactose intolerance, where you don't make enough of the enzyme lactase, you don't break down the lactose, you get gas, bloating, and diarrhea. That's an acquired condition in most cases, because as it turns out, the lactase enzyme is in the lining of the small intestine. When you have leaky gut, it's not just stuff leaking in, it's stuff leaching out, like these so-called brush border enzymes. Another one a lot of doctors don't know about is diamine oxidase, which breaks down the histamine and histamine containing foods, and it can cause histamine reactions. And so you can replace with diamine oxidase, but it's a brush border enzyme. Fix the gut, you seal and heal the gut, fix the cheesecloth, and then these brush border enzymes rise and you're less likely to react to foods. So enzyme deficiencies, which are most often acquired, is one mechanism whereby you react to foods. We mentioned MSG and aspartame. That's sort of what I call a drug side effect type reaction. You're reacting to the food, but you're not per se allergic. When you think about true allergies, that's where the immune system gets involved. And within immune-mediated reactions, you have antibody-mediated and non-antibody-mediated. The prototype of the non-antibody mediated would be so-called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. You don't do well with gluten, but you don't have the antibodies that define the celiac patient. And that's mediated through non-specific inflammatory compounds that get released called cytokines. That's the real conundrum, because the only way to really figure that out is to go on a gluten-free trial for a while and see how it affects you. So within antibody mediated, you've got IgE, which the allergists are all about, and that's where you get the prick test on the back. That's one. There's IgG. These IgG antibodies come from the lining of the intestine, from the so-called GALT tissue. So you have IgE, IgG, IgA, IgM. So it's a little bit nuanced to try and understand the ways, multiple ways we can react to foods. And I mentioned in the case of Hashimoto's, that being a reaction through cross-reactivity. But at the end of the day, if you ask me what I did for 25 years, it was fix people's cheesecloth. So what causes your gut to be leaky? And, you know, doctors still feel like this is sort of a quacky thing. And they think, I had somebody tell me the other day that they thought this whole gluten thing was a fad. And I said, yeah, so's pickleball, because somebody told me pickleball was a fad too, but it's real. And why do you think there's so many restaurants that have gluten-free options? Because people that have tried going gluten-free for a while feel better and they don't want to have it. So if there weren't all these people out there that realize they're probably non-celiac gluten sensitive, if not celiac, there wouldn't be all these gluten-free options. So what causes leaky gut? So diet's one. Gluten's a chicken and an egg. It can cause your gut to be leaky. If you have leaky gut, you're more likely to react to it. Pathogenic microorganisms like pathogenic yeast, bacteria, and parasites. And then medications, the most common would be drugs like ibuprofen. So we see a lot of patients that are all achy because they have leaky gut and they've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Or, you know, with functional medicine, we're not so concerned about what you call it. It's more about why you have it. But then they start popping ibuprofen to treat their systemic inflammation, and that's just making the leaky gut worse. The thing that I would add to this slide is environmental toxins, and we talked about glyphosate, but there are a lot of other ones. So this is a real patient. He was 40-something, middle-aged. His liver enzymes are slightly elevated. He goes to the gastroenterologist, and then they order this huge panel of autoimmune ANA tests and whatnot. His anti-mitochondrial antibodies came back positive, and he was diagnosed with primary cholangitis, which is often a fatal diagnosis. So he thinks he's going to die from this, which all got started by slightly elevated liver enzymes and slightly elevated anti-mitochondrial antibodies. And I told him, I said, you probably have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and we need to seal and heal your gut and see what happens. So we did our leaky gut protocol. Liver enzymes normalized, anti-mitochondrial antibodies came back to normal, and he's fine, feels great. Now, the problem here is that he's probably screwed for the rest of his life when it comes to getting insurance, because he's got this diagnosis of primary cholangitis on his record. And so that's the thing, that just another aspect of this that really makes me upset. So here's kind of the conclusion, and you can read it. You're going to hear more about leaky gut. And again, for fun, go on PubMed and Google leaky gut, go Google increased intestinal permeability. I've been preaching this for a long time, and I'm glad to see that it's kind of coming more mainstream. I was doing the happy dance when I saw this recent study showing the relationship to leaky gut and autoimmune disorders. Kind of like I told you so. So this is me. I'm actually starting a new part-time business, and I'm going to introduce you to my partner in this. This is Hannah Newman, who's a nurse practitioner who has 7 years primary care experience and recently finished her formal training at the Institute of Functional Medicine. And so I retired in September, took a few months off, and now I'm just itching to kind of do something, because there's only so much pickleball you can play. And so we're going to start this consulting business, Take Charge of Your Health LLC. So that's all I have to say. I hope I left enough time for a few questions.
You did, and Heather will open it up for our attendees, but I want to tie the piece and everything, and obviously every time that we get to hear you, Dr. Guillory, it's always impressive, and obviously We'll share personal, for both Heather and I. You've obviously changed our lives for a number of years in regards to everything that you've done for us personally from a functional medicine perspective. But for those of you, before we open it up, obviously, one of the goals that we in creating Voluntary Advantage was to be cutting the edge ahead of the curve. So the question that I've had a couple of text messages is, how do we tie this to what we're doing? We've all set in on the RX spend or the medical spend with any given client. We also know that the tools and financial vehicles that we have at our disposal from a voluntary perspective are able to bring in individuals like this. And we want to be ahead of the curve if we're going to drive down medical spend. Continuing to do what we're doing currently, we're never going to get there. And we know if we do not cure the root cause of why this is happening and continue to spend everything on the symptom and not get to it, we'll never get ahead of that. So that's why we wanted to bring Dr. Guillory on for you all. And before we got on the call today, I was sharing with him, I was in DC a couple of weeks ago for CapCon, and an individual like Dr. Guillory did the very similar speech, and there was over 1,000 of us consultants and brokers, and the room fell dead silent because of the numbers that they were sharing, that individuals that she was doing, that Dr. Gerard will be able to do for you, to go in to meet with your clients and be able to have these type of discussions with them to drive down the spend cost, and most importantly, bring a change for healthy individuals. We also know what that will do from that perspective. So we can't thank you enough. We've opened it up for some questions. See if anybody comes in here. Heather, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything from your perspective.
No, I was just going to say, when you look at these biological agents like Enbrel and Humira, the ones you see advertised all the time, these are extremely expensive, and rheumatology costs have risen like 400% in the last decade or so. And this is a way to address it that's simple. And we did a lot pre-COVID. I was doing a lot of speaking to groups about speaking to their employees. And the title of my talk was "Take Charge of Your Health." It's like, here are some things that you can do to kind of try and figure things out before, things get really bad.
Yeah, that was my question, Dr. Guillory, was, how do we bring a solution like yours to our employer clients? Is it, to have, bring you in to speak with employees, or how does this work?
So I think I always tell patients there's two things it takes if you want to change behavior. One is motivation. You've got to want to. And a lot of these people with autoimmune inflammatory conditions, they don't feel well. And I could just give you hundreds of examples. You can look at our Google reviews. But the second thing it takes is knowledge. I mean, you can be motivated to do whatever it is you want to do, but sometimes you're going about it the wrong way. Many times you're doing the exact opposite of what you should be doing. And so what we bring to the table is the knowledge, and we can't, it's hard to give them the motivation, but a lot of these, if you don't feel well, you're going to be motivated to change. And one of my mentors when I was in medical school, and he was asking me what I wanted to do, and he told me, because I always like things where people hurt, because if you make the pain go away, they love you and it's very gratifying. So I've focused a lot of my work on irritable bowel syndrome. The number one cardinal feature of that is abdominal pain, and the other thing I'm interested in is headaches.
Dr. Gilbert, we had a question come in. What is the best way to access nutritional panels to understand food sensitivities?
Well, probably the best that.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, perfect. Got it. Yep. Best way to access.
So the best way to access that, that's why I gave that big explanation about food reactions and the mechanisms that underlie them. There's not one panel that can tell you that you're reacting to these things. So if you're reacting to MSG, that's a stimulation of the NMDA receptor. If you have an enzyme deficiency, an antibody test is not going to tell you. So if you do, let's say, an IgG food allergy test, that'll give you a piece of the pie. And if it's a good lab, it's a good piece of information. But you still could be reacting to a food on another level. But for years before we had all these cutting edge functional medicine tests, and what got me interested in IBS was an interest in food intolerances. We did a lot of dietary manipulation and just, restrictive diets. And those are kind of hard to do, but sometimes it's worthwhile. Put somebody on a very elemental diet and gradually add foods in.
Another question came in, are functional medicine doctors typically covered by insurance? I will tell you, yes, from our perspective, they are. But Dr. Gilrey, anything you want to add to that? We have another question right after that.
So I would say that most functional medicine practitioners are not medical doctors. A lot of them are chiropractors, naturopaths, nutritionists. They do great work. But when I was saying earlier, we did both traditional and functional, so we could prescribe your high blood pressure medicines and at the same time offer natural treatments. In my experience, most functional medicine practitioners are cash only. And the other thing that was different about our practice is I wasn't one that did tons of expensive testing up front, because based on my experience and intuition and realizing that most people have limited resources, I would tell my patients, we can do all this testing, but I'd rather see you spend, if you have limited resources, on what we think is likely to help you rather than a bunch of testing and then you're broke.
Perfect. Last question, about 30 seconds. Great question, by the way. Are there other environmental changes to the food system over the years? You offered some examples that may be exaggerated the prevalence of leaky gut.
Well, there's, I don't know, 40, 50,000 toxins out there, and it's hard to say how much each is playing a part. I think the other reason to eat organic is to get more nutrients from your soil-rich food. It's kind of fun if you take, this is the last thing I'll say is, for an experiment, go get a nice organic apple and go get a regular apple and slice it, and then let it sit there and watch which one turns brown faster, because the one that's nutrient dense, if it's a good organic apple, is not going to turn dark as quickly as the one that's doesn't have all these antioxidants, because it's oxidation that's causing the apple to turn brown.
Awesome stuff. We had just some feedback came in. Everyone's very excited. For those of you, thank you again, Dr. Gilrey. For those of you that are on, please reach out to Heather and myself. You obviously see the email. Please reach out directly as well, or feel to reach out to Heather and I. Hopefully you take advantage of the service. I can say on a personal level, absolutely changed both our lives for the better. Hopefully we can do that on a greater scale with some of your clients or within one of your groups itself. So thanks again all, and thanks again, Dr. Gilrey.
Hey, thank you so much.